I'm Mel Thomas, a facilitator with the agency. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We have 3 desired outcomes for today. We'd like to share understanding about the progress that's been made up to this point. Been a lot of hard work going on behind the scenes. Want to identify next steps, and in the middle, I want to give you an opportunity to review the draft list of conceptual projects and get an initial response, and you'll have some time to think about that and provide an additional response afterward when you have a chance to review these things more. Should I go to our 2 representatives? Who's going first? Oh, Monica.
Our meeting yesterday, again, had this same agenda. Probably the key piece for me was when we actually got down to the actual conceptual project list. We were having a hard time because it's a long list. It's a very long list. If you hadn't looked on the SharePoint, I don't know, 168 some projects in there. When I personally reviewed it, I quickly figured out, okay, there were certain projects that repeated. It was because it was the so-called regional or interconnect ones. And so, at least my recommendation at that time was it would almost be better for each of the, I would call them government entities, to adjourn, get their small group together, the citizen rep, the government rep, the SG1 rep, and maybe look at the ones unique to their own situation and give a better quality feedback that way. But we're still gonna, I think, go through some of that exercise today, but that was part of the point I made, and I already informed my city manager that we need to schedule a meeting, so that was kind of a key point.
He's not available.
Other than that, I think everything else was pretty much, keeping us up to date on some of the other stuff going on. Kevin, did you want to add anything to that?
Maybe just one, if Bill doesn't mind. Good morning, everybody. Kevin Chaplin with Newport. The only thing I would add, Monica, is a reoccurring theme from some, if not maybe many in our group, that as we develop systems in the future, there's an interest to build these to what they keep saying is a no detect level of PFAS. And I know MDH will probably have something to say about that as soon as I'm done, because she pushed back a little yesterday, and I get that. But maybe there's a different way to word what many in our group want. Is, minimum health standards, I think, scares everybody, because that number seems to be changing around the country and around the world. And didn't New York just lower their levels here last month or something? I could be wrong about that. So that keeps coming up. So I just wanted to let everybody know. I think the folks that are pushing that agenda would like the fact I mentioned it this morning.
Yeah, we're doing our best here when we plan these meetings, but it was apparent that not everybody had a chance to review the materials as much as we would have liked, and so we'll still have an opportunity to talk a little bit this morning, compare notes with your colleagues, and then you'll get some more time to review. Kirk, anything you want to say about the update? He wants his own mic.
I think the only other thing, just to build on what Monica said, is we're going to get into the conceptual drinking water supply plan. But it was very clear from the citizen business folks that they would like to meet with the cities to learn more. The form that we handed out, the spreadsheet, which was trying to minimize the amount there, I think was not enough detail. So we did show them the community profiles that we have, that we've been, Wood has been working with each community on, and how to get that on the SharePoint. So they'll be reviewing that, and I just, if you could reach out to those that are within your jurisdiction, I know they will be reaching out to you, and we'll be trying to get those together. I think they just want to learn more from the cities and what they're thinking, what these projects are, so they have a better understanding as they move forward too.
I'd just like to say, too, on behalf of the co-trustees and the consultants, that whenever we do propose a way to move forward that doesn't work for folks, we've had some great feedback and great ideas, like Monica's just now, about a way to move forward, and we really appreciate that. You always can find a way to make it better. So any questions? I'm told that the update was rather lengthy, the written one, printed one. Any questions, comments on the updates? Anything else from you folks? Okay, we're ready for Wood to work their magic.
Okay. Good morning. I'm going to kind of echo what Milt said and say that Monica and Kevin kind of touched on about we got some really good feedback from yesterday. So we're going to try to incorporate that in today's presentation as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Erin Doherty with Wood out of our Phoenix office, and I've been working with Brian and Bill there in the back on our conceptual project list. And we have a couple objectives today. I really want to talk to you guys about what the conceptual project list is, how we got there, where we're at in our process, and Brian will come up and then talk to you about our next steps moving forward. So, okay. So, I think everybody here has seen the progress or process flow map, and if we look at this in that context, this is where we're at in terms of putting together the conceptual project list. So, just to kind of reiterate what this conceptual project list is, it's a list, a comprehensive list of all potential projects that will be addressing PFAS contamination for each community. So what we've done is meet with members of each community and really thought about what are the potential projects that we could look at to address PFAS contamination. So that's kind of our goal there, is to just create a list. We're kind of not eliminating anything at this point. These are all potential projects. So how did we get there? So like I said, we've been working with primarily SG1 members, but also other work group members. And we really encourage the work group members to coordinate and communicate with their SG1 members to provide their input and their thoughts on what some of these conceptual projects could be. We also last month met with subgroup 1 members as well as some of the other work group members to kind of go over what we've put together in these conceptual project memos, which I'm going to cover here in a second, and talk about what those projects were and get their feedback specific for each community. And then we encourage everybody, work group members, subgroup 1 members, members of the public, to actually go online and submit their conceptual projects via the online portal, just for formal documentation as well. And we ended up getting about 24 projects through the online portal. So that was one source. We got our conceptual projects from you guys and SG1 members. And as Wood, we kind of also created our additional conceptual projects. And if you remember, I think everybody has seen the water supply improvement option list. We kind of used that as our starting point. And then we took the options that were in that list and really expanded upon them and used them to develop conceptual projects specifically evaluated in the context of each community. And that's kind of what we really explained in our conceptual project memos, which I think have also been called summaries, for each community. And I'm going to pull up an example of that. But some of the characteristics of these memos I just kind of wanted to touch on so that everybody understands what the objective behind these memos are and what they were intended to do. So these memos are actually working documents. We are constantly getting feedback from all work group members, SG1 members, to get their input on what some of these projects are. Excuse me. So they're working documents. It's kind of a comprehensive list of all the projects. It goes into a little bit more detail. We've met with the LG1 or LGU members to kind of talk about what considerations each project might need to look at when reviewing these projects. I'm going to pull one up here. And these are available on the SharePoint. I'll get to that as well. So for example, this is a conceptual project memo for the city of Lakeland. And so what we tried to do was give a community background. So this kind of goes into some characteristics for each community. It talks about the projected populations for 2020 and 2040, looks at the demands for that community, as well as what their water supply situation is. So we looked at what are their wells, what's their capacity, what is their current PFAS contamination status. It kind of talks a little bit about their public water supply or their water distribution system. And as you can see in here, we have some comments, like things that internally we've been thinking about, things that we need to address, things that we'd like to verify with the city. So you really can tell that it is a working document. We're really trying to get the feedback, like what Monica and Kevin were talking about, from all of you guys, to really incorporate this and make it as accurate as possible. As you move through the document, you'll kind of see some of these figures. These are being revised, and we're getting some more accurate GIS maps together. But it kind of goes through, okay, you can see these are all the private wells and some of the municipal wells for this community. So you can kind of see the extent from a health index value of what's going on. And then we get into the comprehensive list of conceptual projects. And I think this is where some of the feedback we got in yesterday's meeting, it's helpful to look at these memos in conjunction with that Excel spreadsheet in terms of the list, because the list had a great intention of just providing a list of all the possible projects for every single community. This kind of broke it down in terms of the projects specific for each community. So we break it down into, from a local option, which is really a community-specific set of options, as well as regional. So you'll see like local options under Lakeland deal with neighborhoods, individuals on private wells, their municipal water supply system, and goes through some of those options and considerations. And then we get into, there's some figures. I apologize if I'm scrolling too quickly here. Some of the regional options, which cover a groundwater regional treatment facility or facilities, as well as a surface water option, whether it be for some communities looking at St. Paul Regional or a surface water treatment plant. So just wanted to go over this as an example. These are available on the SharePoint site, which everybody should have access to. Let's see. Everybody should have gotten an email, and it may be a little misleading, we are Wood, but you will have seen an invite from AMEC. And that, I'm going to pull up what that would look like. You should have access to a site when you get there. It should look something like this. Mine's a little bit different because I have access to a few more different folders, but there is a work group share folder. And when you click on it, it's kind of divided into each of the communities that have a folder. All of the supporting documents will be included in these folders, as well as a PDF copy of the conceptual project list and the Excel file as well. So everybody should, and I actually at this point I think it'd be a good opportunity to introduce Carson Smith. He's with Wood, and he is kind of taking ownership of the SharePoint site. So if you have issues, he would be the one to talk to.
Yeah, so I'm just really quickly going to pass around just the sheet. So if any of you guys are having issues signing into SharePoint, you can put your name and email on the list, and I'll just start by passing it around here.
Sounds great. Thank you, Carson. So yes, and after this, if you'd like to talk to Carson about any issues that you've been having about the SharePoint site, now I'll be able to ask him.
Yeah, if they know, you want them to make a notation about what the issue is, or?
If they know, yeah, correct.
Okay. So that covers the SharePoint and the memos. We'll go back to our slides here. So yeah, so the memos was also our source of conceptual projects. It's a working document. It kind of incorporates some of the feedback that we got from the LJUs, and it really sets the basis for the set of projects that will eventually be bundled into the scenarios that we've been talking about. So from that, we combined everything that was submitted online with our conceptual projects that were from the memos and created our draft of the conceptual project list. And so I think I just kind of want to show hands. Has anybody or has everybody had a chance to look at the list online and kind of go through some of the projects? I'm not seeing very many hands. Okay. That's okay, because we're going to take a look at it. We're going to go through some of these projects, and like you have access or should have access to the SharePoint site, so you can take a look at those, and we'll go through the process here in a bit about how to submit feedback once you do have a chance to go through some of those in a little bit more detail. But I just kind of want to do an overview. Like Monica said, if you are looking at it for the first time, it will probably be a little overwhelming, and that's okay. We can kind of break it down. One of the suggestions that was brought up in yesterday's meeting was maybe focusing on the community-specific ones for your community, if that may be the top priority, and then as you have time to kind of go through the rest of them. But we'll go through a bit of the projects here. So from a breakdown standpoint, like we talked about, we had some online submitted projects and what we're calling those wood submitted projects, those that we kind of developed from the water supply improvement option list in the context of each community, and kind of got some feedback from the LGUs. So those make up a good chunk of it because we looked at all of those projects based off the water supply improvement options for each community. So you've got 14 communities there were 10 water supply improvement options, so it's a lot, especially since at this point we're just looking, like I said, at the potential projects from an all-inclusive standpoint. So we haven't quite eliminated much at this point. So that's breakdown. We also looked at the projects in terms of scale.
Can I just ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
So the 168, as Monica mentioned, there's a lot of duplication.
Correct.
Is that in considering all the duplication that's there?
Yes. So
Is there a reason why that duplication wasn't
that was some feedback.
mined out?
Yeah, that was some feedback that we got from our group yesterday.
Because it's hard to know the exact number of actual individual, if there's so much duplication between what a
Yes.
city submits or a township and what Wood has there.
We agree, and we kind of internally discussed this about a better way to break those down. And like one of the options was maybe to look at, like, if we're just looking at those unique projects. I think moving forward as we do future presentations, that could be one of the things that we do differently. I think at this point we were just looking at the raw numbers. We'll go through the list and we have it kind of filtered out. So these were just looking at raw numbers for those that were like.
But it's kind of meaningless, frankly, because if there's duplication, some of this is just, it's not gonna make sense because you're doubling up on some.
Right, I understand. I think it's still good to kind of look at the distribution. I mean, I see what you're saying in terms of the duplication and what those numbers may be a little misleading, but it's consistent throughout. So I think relatively speaking, if we were to look at this in terms of percentages, it just gives a good idea of the distribution of these projects.
The duplication is more on the regional one. So if there's an interconnect between Cottage Grove and Newport, it's showing up twice because it's in each of those communities. So as you're looking at the individual neighborhood and municipal, those are pretty much the numbers. The duplication is more on just the regional part of the circle. So there are a lot of numbers there that are still pretty accurate.
Yes, agreed. And I think that's definitely some feedback though that we're going to take into consideration as a better way to kind of represent what those unique projects are.
Well, for us, our municipals are duplicated by the Wood. So, I don't know how everyone else is, but ours were duplicated.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's okay, it's just that these numbers
enormous.
become insignificant if it's not been cleaned up and mined down to individual actual projects, that's all I'm saying.
Yes, no, totally understand. So keeping that in mind as we move forward, we did separate projects in the list based on scale as well. So we're looking at these projects in terms of from an individual standpoint, neighborhood standpoint, municipal, and like we talked about with regional. And we'll go into a little bit more of the specifics of what each of those projects looks like. Briefly, if you're thinking about individual projects, think private wells. Like, how are we going to address those people on private wells? Are we going to just provide point of entry treatment systems? Are we going to do small rural treatment systems? Are we going to connect them to an existing public water supply system? So that's kind of why we're trying to address individuals. If we're looking at small neighborhoods, again, do we supply a small rural, what we're calling rural system? Or do we connect them to the public water supply? From a municipal standpoint, are we drilling new supply wells, treating those existing supply wells, or maybe have a small centralized treatment facility for any given one community? Regional, they said there's some duplicates in there, and we've also later kind of segregated this into a small and large scale regionals, but it's basically anything that involves 2 or more communities. So it could be as simple as an interconnect between 2 neighboring communities, or a very large scale regional that addresses multiple communities throughout the East Metro area. So we'll get into those in a little bit. Again, like I said, there are probably a little bit of redundancy in these numbers as well, but we just tried to kind of vary from a high level look at how these projects were distributed based on community. There's also going to be difference in these numbers based on their extent of contamination. So, for example, like we saw with Lakeland, they have 2 municipal supply wells that have not been impacted by PFAS in terms of their health index values are less than 1. So we kind of were able to explore a lot of options from a theoretical standpoint, whereas maybe some of those smaller rural communities had a little fewer options than some, say, larger communities. So this just kind of showed the distribution from a community standpoint. The other thing I just wanted to note was when we're looking at these projects, and we'll get into this in a little bit too, that note at the bottom, like I said, there's some overlap there, but the projects are not mutually exclusive. It may come down to the fact that a couple different projects are suitable for any given one community. Maybe it doesn't make sense for some people that are on private wells to connect. So you have kind of a couple projects that address the existing public water supply and those people on private wells in any given one community. Or for a community that doesn't have a public water supply, say everybody's on private wells, there may be a couple different projects that work for any given region of that community. So it's not mutually exclusive. We're trying to look at this from multiple standpoints. So this goes back to the water supply improvement options. And I apologize, I don't want to throw any more acronyms at anybody, and it is abbreviated on here, but that's what the WSIO stands for, water supply improvement options, that we have talked about in our past meetings, which, like I mentioned, were kind of the basis for the development of some of these conceptual projects. And so this just kind of was another way to categorize the conceptual projects and relate it back to something that you've seen in the past. There was also a few other projects that were submitted from the online portal that didn't necessarily fall into any of these categories, or thank you, Mil, or necessarily under the priority 1 scope either. So I think there was a total of 5 other projects, and we'll kind of touch on those as well. But this just shows a bit of a breakdown in terms of the types of projects that we're seeing. And that's kind of covered on this slide. So this actually goes kind of into the scale that we had talked about in terms of what were the conceptual projects that we were seeing and that we've developed. Starting on the smaller end to the left, we have our individuals and neighborhoods. So like I said, for those on private wells, some of the solutions could be the point of entry treatment systems, connecting to a small, what we're calling rural supply system with treatment if necessary, or connecting those individuals or neighborhoods to an existing public water supply system, whether that's in their community or even in a neighboring community. The next scale would be those local municipal options, and like I said, those are much more community specific. So you're looking in that case of drilling new municipal supply wells, providing treatment at existing well sites, or providing centralized treatment for those communities' municipal supply wells. So much more community centric. We get into then our regional options, which are still in the process of being developed. So you can establish small regional systems through interconnects. Like I said, it could just be 2 communities, 2 neighboring communities, or maybe it's 3 neighboring communities. You're not at this scale looking quite at the entire East Metro area, but just rather like groupings of communities. That could also involve centralized water treatment facilities on the borders of these communities to supply treatment from either their existing municipal wells and or new municipal supply wells. that may be needed. The large scale, then we kind of start to look at things more in the context of the entire East Metro area. So we're looking at maintaining a groundwater regional system, but also looking at the option of a surface water system. So whether that be connecting to St. Paul Regional Water Supply for those that it's applicable to, or a new surface water treatment plant on either the Mississippi or the St. Croix River, depending on which communities. We also lumped in the previous water supply improvement options, 9 and 10, into this large-scale regional to include water conservation efforts that all communities are currently doing, as well as the 3M containment water options, and looking at how we can reuse those. There was a couple of projects like we'll see that had to deal with recharge of that. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question? So if there's any one of these things that from a local government unit perspective, thank you. Thanks. If there's any one of these solutions that collectively from a local government unit perspective is a non-starter,
Mm-hmm.
should we be discussing that here? I'll get specific with what I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
So from everything I've heard from folks here, and certainly internal to us, we've really looked a lot at the surface water option. We studied it before when we had SEH come in. As a city, we visited plants, we've talked through and through this issue with really an open mind. And we've just come full circle to the fact that from our perspective, a surface water option is just not even worth the time and effort to put on there because of the challenges it faces, from a monetary challenge to a taste and odor challenge to so many other things. Our systems are based on the groundwater. So from us, our view of the world, groundwater is a key tenet. And if we all, if from all of our local government units, if we all agree that we don't want to spend the time and the money on surface water options because it's just not a non-starter from us as a working group, should we even have it on the list? So I'm opening that up as just a line of conversation. And again, it's an evolving process as we've been learning, growing, studying, listening, and digging deep into this issue. I just haven't heard any of us, and I know for us in Woodbury in particular, be able to embrace that as a legitimate option worth
Nope.
review.
I'm actually really glad you asked that question because it's actually been brought up by a couple other communities that also have done feasibility studies. And like you said, have their own plan. And that's actually why we wanted to incorporate and dedicate a scenario to the community's submitted plans. And I mean, we were previously calling them preferred because that really fell in line with what the city plan and their comprehensive plan was and their plan for their future. So we are looking at that option. That's why we encouraged all the LGU members when we met with them to submit those projects through the online portal so that it was formally documented. But again, at this point, we are really just trying to create a comprehensive list, and that type of evaluation is something that will cause those options maybe to fall out. I think there's some evaluation that still needs to be done. But.
So this is a conversation we had at the Citizen Business Work Group yesterday also about some of these that may have lower technical feasibility or more less political desire to go to certain projects. And there was a number of folks who said that it would still be good to go through those projects, do the work, so that when we later make decisions, even if those are not the decisions, there's documentation on why those were looked at and why those fell out versus just cutting things off today. And so that was one of just the feedback. I don't know if Monica or Kevin have anything to add to that, but that was one of the thoughts.
There was a huge concern that when the public looks at this documentation, if we aren't clear why things dropped off, and again, Clint.
I'm not saying we should
No,
be clear.
Clint, well,
Okay.
as clear as we can be.
Okay.
But I mean, if you can cite analysis that was done by your city that said, okay, this just isn't gonna be a workable solution, whether it's a financial issue, all the water quality issues and so on, at least give some reasoning, you know, here was this big long list, here's why some of these dropped off. People felt that we owed the public some of that information.
I'm not proposing this as a matter of gut level or intuitive or political, as you said, Kurt. I mean, what I don't want to see, you know, when options live, and they live deep into a process, they can gain a life of their own. And we are challenged because of all the things we're doing with focus. So if something's a non-starter for good reasons that we can document on a whole host of reasons, I'm concerned about having an item live because, again, it can gain traction, it takes energy, it takes time, it takes focus away. And I think in some levels, we're charged here to be high level, okay? We're not the subgroup one. And as large, big picture folks, we need to set some standards and criteria for the review of these things. And if surface water for good documented reasons is removed from the list because we're setting sort of the parameters, which is, again, what I understand part of our role, setting the parameters for the criteria to evaluate viable projects. If we're all in uniform agreement, if not, then it moves on. If it's not, it continues on. But I've seen things gain a life because it lives and it lives and it lives and it steals energy and it steals time and it clogs up and then all of a sudden it's at the end. So I guess I haven't heard any really advocacy by the local government units for surface water. The question becomes when is the right time to really draw some conclusions on that? In fact, I even wonder with respect to the criteria evaluation document. Is that the right, because we're setting those criteria, and those criteria will be huge in terms of what gets funded. Where and what is the right place to say, collectively, if we're in agreement, this is a non-starter. This has so much in the way of cost and quality and technical impacts and so forth that none of the LGOs want to have this further considered.
Kevin, did you want to? Sure.
Well, I appreciate Clint bringing this up, but I may disagree a little, maybe specifically just for Newport, because St. Paul Regional Water is literally right at our northern border. So I know we've discussed the potential interconnect. Whether my engineering folks are comfortable with that at this exact moment or not, I'm not sure. We haven't discussed it in the last 30 days. But I think for that reason alone, for us in St. Paul Park, we should probably keep it on the list, at least for now. And then with the issues going on with White Bear Lake and lawsuits, I think we should at least keep it on the list. I think for what Monica was saying and for the communities that are over that direction, it needs to be looked at well and it needs to be documented, because if White Bear starts going back down again, which we all probably figure it's going to go up, it's going to come down, it's going to be an issue. And if there's lawsuits involved, I think we need to exhaust all our options. So maybe that's my take on the subject, respectively.
And just briefly before we return to Aaron, I'll just say I'm hearing Clint say two different things, though. We're talking about that one specific option, but he's also talking about a more general principle that if there's consensus, can we winnow down the list?
Yeah, and just to kind of touch on it, I mean, I think I understand where you're coming from, and we want to let those evaluations speak for themselves. And I think the surface water treatment option is not exclusive for any one community. There's benefits to the economies of scale, and I think it would be more of a regional option, but we would still like to explore it. And like, we've worked with Woodbury, we've worked with Lake Elmo, and so there's some other communities that have done some of these feasibility studies, and we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There are good reasons that some things have been eliminated from a community standpoint, but we also have to look at it in the context of a regional approach as well. So those are things that those evaluations will come into play as we start to really go forward. At this point, we're just trying to establish a final list to work off of. So, just want to say that. But good thoughts.
You're rarely going to hear me agree with Clint, but I do this time, right? So mark it out. And I still think that the second time he had the mic, he asked the question that I wanted to ask, and I don't know that we've gotten the answer still, and that is, when are we going to start eliminating some of these things? You've referenced that we've done, whether it's the regional coalition study or individuals have done feasibility studies. At what point in time do we try and bring some efficiency to this process and have those documented reasons for taking some of those out for some of the communities, not, region-wide, but I think that as we look at pushing back the deadline for when we're going to complete this, I'm wondering, are there things that we can do to be more efficient? And again, I'm not sure we got an answer to Clint's question about when that happens.
That is actually, go ahead.
Well, I think that's also, the reasons, that this Woods work here, we've asked them to just look at the technical engineering aspects of it. And a number of the issues, I know having conversations the local government units had with Wood and that, some of those are different rationales on why that's done. And so I think we do want to see what is there. If we have documentation, I know that's one of the things we've been talking about, how do we use the SEH study in conjunction with this process so that we don't have to necessarily redo the work as necessary. But each community had different filters on what was the reason why certain things came off. And I think that's, at this point, I think it's still good to see what those are. We can come looking at this with all of our kind of guts on where they're going to go on some of these, but we end up then potentially losing some of the synergies we have with projects that are together, or something that's brought up in one community that is not brought up by another community, and see when it's put in that context that may have some benefits or things not being thought of already. And we've seen that already as we've been working with some of these projects where there have been things which some communities had not thought of when brought up by Wood, or Wood brought up that other communities have done. And so we are starting to see some of that. I think there's a fine line, that on this it's not perfect when that point is, but we have been seeing benefits of having these conversations on a wider lens to start to pull in some of these ideas.
But the question was when?
So, can I jump in? So actually, Brian is going to come up here after I am to really kind of go through this process. I think the first step is really setting that deadline of this is it. These are all the projects from a comprehensive standpoint of the conceptual projects we're looking at, and really start that evaluation, because the next thing will be, these are the basis for this scenario. So for example, you have the regional scenario. We're going to have pull from, basically this is our bucket for that scenario, list all of those out, and where there's overlap, where we have to decide, okay, for any given community, how do we address those people on private wells? We have the three options. Do we do the point of entry treatment? Do we provide them with rural water systems, or do we connect them? So now we have to do kind of that evaluation, because only one of those is moving forward to be evaluated in this scenario. So that's when we start. We've talked about iterations and we've thrown out a lot of verbiage at you, but that's really where we start to break down the evaluations and go through that process so that we can slowly start to assign our metrics of cost. Maybe there's other regulation issues like White Bear Lake. Lake Elmo has the special well construction area, so there's those considerations that are also going to have to come into play, and really start evaluating those so that we can move forward to that scenario evaluation. But this is kind of the first step of saying, here's our bucket, and this is all we're looking at. But we also want to make sure that we're not leaving anything out, and that's why we want to get your feedback today, and have you guys have a chance to review this list to just make sure, because we don't want to get to the end and have somebody saying, why didn't you think of this? Oh my gosh,
So you still haven't answered the question of when do we start to cull this down? So you take a shot at it. I want to get a context of when we start working this down.
Well,
As we go through the process that we showed last time, and that a lot of these technical things are moving forward to be looked at. you know, when we start, that's what the criteria filter is, to start weeding out some of this, but you have to have base information to be able to apply criteria on these. And so I think that, excuse me, is where we're at, and as we'll go through these a little bit more here, and we talked about last month, that these scenarios are moving forward for the technical piece without some of the, what it's gonna be, what the costs are before some of the criteria and that are being applied. And it's that criteria pieces we move forward to be able to look at.
So for example, we had this kind of conversation in the meeting yesterday. We'd like to get your guys' feedback. We had set a previous deadline, but because of complications with the SharePoint site, we've actually extended that deadline. So there is a deadline for the review of these conceptual projects. And as we move forward, we're going to have self-imposed deadlines for each of these scenarios and evaluations that haven't been set yet in stone, but that's kind of where we're moving to, is to set that.
I'm hearing you say that there'll be a timeline presented shortly, and if that doesn't satisfy the question, we can come back to it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of words for we don't know.
No, it's coming up.
Or
coming up.
next month or 2 months.
It's coming up in about 20 minutes. That's what she said.
Yeah, we don't.
And I saw it yesterday, so I have the
All
option
right.
of that.
I'm just trying to find out the order of things, that's all.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll get to it, and if not, we can definitely talk after the
Okay.
meeting, because we definitely want you to be comfortable with our timeline as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we kind of went through some of the examples of the types of projects that you're gonna see. We'll briefly kind of go over the others, and I don't want to make it seem like these don't have a place. They are being addressed. They just need a little bit more consideration and discussion as to how they fit in, if they do fit into our conceptual project list. There are a couple that were submitted. We're calling them resiliency, but really there was one that was brought up about water quality testing at municipal wells. And that's something that we're going to have to discuss with NPH and then PCA in terms about what's the current sampling schedule. Oh, I'm sorry, current sampling schedule, and what are our options moving forward there. Newport had also submitted a project with regards to their distribution system about looping. So that was looking at it from more of an infrastructure and hydraulic evaluation. That would probably be considered and could be covered under the conceptual projects if we're looking at interconnects, because as we look through that option of interconnecting with other communities, then we're definitely going to have the hydraulic model to look at what other things, booster pump stations, pressure reducing valves are needed for that. So that would kind of fall into maybe that project. There was also a couple projects that more fell under the priority 2 scope in terms of looking at aquifer recharge and aquifer management. So those might be considered under priority 2. There's also a project that brought up reverse osmosis, and looking at that, I think in the context for those that are on private wells that will need treatment, we've really focused our efforts on the GAC simply from a financial standpoint. Reverse osmosis is very expensive, and typically you would find that like at a point of use, so maybe under the sink. We're really looking at point of entry, so outside the house, so the entire home is treated, and we start to look at the reverse osmosis cost for a system of that size. The costs are just significantly more. So we haven't excluded that, but it's very unlikely that that would be a viable solution just from a cost standpoint. So those were the other projects. So as I mentioned, we're going to do an exercise today where we break into small groups, and so we have a chance to really go over the conceptual project list. We'd really like to get your feedback. So we're going to put some questions up on the board, give you guys a chance to go over those and come up with some good talking points, really just looking for how your thoughts on the list. Are there things that we've missed? Are there things that maybe you're reconsidering at this point? But we'll get into those, and I guess that would be probably a good time. Milt, do you want to help me break people into groups?
Yeah, and then you'll show them the questions.
Yeah.
Yep, so, well, we'll just have you split down the middle if you don't mind. It looks like you folks are not locked in like the other group, so I think you can stay in your neighborhood. So like 5 people on each corner, and to just respond to these questions.
Decide which way you want to go, Clint.
Can't be by.
Now you're in the
You
middle.
know, do you
Yeah,
do you have a set time?
usually
Do you
am.
wanna keep-
Yeah, I was gonna shoot for about 15 minutes of small group deliberation, and then we'll have the individuals all provide their responses.
We do have some printed copies of the list that we'll pass out as well, so you guys can have an actual copy, and we can put it up on the screen, but it is tiny, but we'll get those passed out.
So can I use this?
Okay, so the three questions, if they help you deliberate, or do the conceptual projects meet your expectations? Are there any projects that you feel are missing and should be considered? Are there any projects that you are reconsidering?
Other people, you guys want to come join too?
Something happens. You got it.
See, if he walks away and gets elected, that was great.
All right, in a few minutes, we'll check in with the public.
So that's why again, you provide the protection so you don't try to measure it. Sure.
I entertain myself. But before we do that, the co-trustees always want to be sure that every individual that's working as a member of this group gets a chance to say what's on their mind. So, gonna pass the microphone around, starting with what so far today has been the quiet side of the room. And you have the option to pass, but we'd love to just hear what's on your mind as you get ready to either independently or, like Monica suggested, get together with your SG1 member and your citizen member and talk about this. What are you thinking as you think about the list of conceptual projects and how adequate it is?
Well, I think the list of conceptual projects is adequate, or it meets expectations in terms of the broad range of them. Now, one thing that came up as we were talking and about the surface water piece, that should that be in or out? One, I don't know if it's actually in these lists, but the option of having some sort of a surface water supply that wouldn't actually go into anybody's water system. It would be used to recharge the aquifer. And that went back to several months ago when we had the discussion, okay, if we throw out surface water as an option, are we sure that groundwater is going to provide a sufficient supply as far into the future as we can see? And I thought we said we were going to look at that and see if that was the case or wasn't the case. But if we're looking at resiliency, would it make sense to look at not that we're going to create a surface water system that actually becomes part of any city's water system, but it would only be used, for example, in the case where we get to a point where groundwater there isn't a sufficient supply of groundwater to supply the needs, and then we could just use a surface water, some sort of a surface water system to just recharge the aquifer.
Lowell Johnson, Washington County. Yeah, I think Ron captured some of my thoughts too. I'm pleased that there's still a variety of options included in the concept, because I think that's what builds a resilient system for the future. I hearken back to the presentation we had about, I think it was the Washington DC metro area, that they kind of, based on condition-specific situations, they use a variety of sources and have some shared utility between various communities, that kind of thing. Maybe they're standalone for the most part, 90% of the time it's the current system, but there are conditions in which the river plays a part of a system, or that the reservoirs or other kinds of things. The other thing in mind, and I know this is a later work plan for the overall process, but kind of thinking high and best use of a variety of water types, and where do we use, what type of water do we really want to use for industrial purposes or for irrigation kinds of things versus potable drinking water supplies, that kind of thing. So using the right water for the right purpose, and being mindful of that for the future of the community.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I had some questions about resiliency as well. We did talk about it in our group, and I think it was covered by Ron and Lowell as well. I do think that conceptual project list met expectations, but it's pretty difficult to digest, particularly if you're not technical, you don't have that technical background. So I looked through it, I took as close an eye to it as I could, but it's pretty difficult to digest, I think. So, but we'll get to that more, I think, as we talk about it more.
Your comments just remind me one more point. I'm such a visual person that I'm anxious to see overlays and maps and these systems starting to be depicted on graphically, so that I can see some visuals of that. And I know some of that is on the SharePoint site, but I'm anxious to get to that stage because it's hard for me to just read off of a list.
Aaron, were you gonna say something?
Well, yeah, I wanted to also encourage you, like you said, there's the memos that are on the SharePoint site that are broken down into the community, so it's a little bit easier. There are some figures in there, but like you brought up, we are putting together some large-scale GIS maps that will have those overlays that you're looking for. It's got, the pipeline layouts. Like, we're not going to throw out too much information about anybody's given public water supply for security reasons, but you'll at least be able to kind of see that. There's data on there with regards to testing, which wells already have GAC systems installed, so you can kind of see that layout. So a lot of the supporting documents will start to accumulate in those folders on the SharePoint site, so you can visually see it. So it's a work in progress, but they will definitely be there, so just want to let you know.
Can you show us where the memos are in the SharePoint?
Oh, yeah. So like I said, if you're having any issues with access to the SharePoint, or if you need another email sent out about the address for the website, Carson in the back there, Carson, is happy to help you. So you'll get to the home page, and yours may look a little bit different than mine, but yours will have this work group share folder right here on the side. So you'll still have that folder. Mine just has a lot of folders. So it's broken down into each community. So that's where you'll find the memo. I should probably give you an example of one that has some supporting documentation. Woodbury, do you have some? Shoot. We may have just focused on getting the memos up there, but the maps and the other supporting documents will be located in those folders. So again, if you need that address though, you can send it back out. And again, that email will come from AMEC. Just a quick background, AMEC was bought out by Wood, so we'll know that our company was previously AMEC, and that's why it will come from an AMEC source.
Just a few comments to add. Sean Finwell, City of Maplewood. So what I thought was beneficial was how the projects were broken down into individual, neighborhood, and regional. So you could see all of those different aspects and how they might work. One thing I thought that was missing, and I think Lowell touched on this, was the water reuse opportunity, and maybe that's in another phase. And then Maplewood, a majority of our residents are on St. Paul Regional Water Services, and so clearly we have some easy fixes in our South Lake just to connect to that water system. And I certainly appreciate the fact that many communities have spent a big investment in their water systems for groundwater. But I think it's so important to look at the feasibility of surface water, where it makes sense. And I wouldn't recommend dropping that at this time, because in Maplewood, you know, it has been a good system for our residents. They don't experience any smells or tastes in the water system. It's been a safe system, and it's cost effective for us. So just give you that aspect of living in Maplewood and how it's working there. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think I have anything to add. I had a good group of colleagues here this morning.
You know, in terms of the document, like Jessica said, it was a lot. So I can't really pass too much judgment. I read the parts for Woodbury. And I just wanted to, you know, maybe clarify a little bit on the surface water issue. I mean, for sure, Maplewood has it. I understand that. I'm just trying to get to more focus, efficiency. The thing that's really impacted us is we've been on tour. And I really had a big mind change in talking with operators who are working on plants that mix surface and ground, and now understand the incredible complexity that that has. We've also looked at communities that have surface and ground in different zones, and have learned about the equity issues that can arise in that, and then also some of the chemistry. So as I've gone from the very macro to the operator delivering of water, it's been a big, you know, big mind change in terms of that complexity, not even to speak of the capital cost that the SEH studies. So that's just the thought that's been on my mind. Conceptually, oh yeah, that sounds really like a good option. Resiliency for sure. But there is a level of delivering water at an operator level, at a plant level, that I think maybe many of us, big picture people might not appreciate. So I've come to appreciate that now, and that's why the advocacy for groundwater, not at least also our system, as you mentioned, Sean, is all based on that. So.
For Cottage Grove, I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you talked about surface water, but then just the efficiency of groundwater. So we've been setting up our system for decades. It's a groundwater-based system, and part of that was planning for treatment. So it didn't matter if it was PFAS or nitrates, whatever it is, it's been in our plan. So our project, we submitted one project, it's consistent with our planning efforts over the years, and it's a very efficient plan, we feel like. With our intermediate zone, we have 7 wells that are right next to each other. They all go to a single line. We have a city-owned property to put a plant on. I mean, it's a very efficient way to treat our system. So vice versa, you've got what we've looked at as well, the inefficiencies or cost of the surface water, but just how effective groundwater treatment can be, because that's what we've been planning for.
I'll pass.
In terms of the questions, I guess, I'm not sure exactly what my expectations should have been. And in full disclosure, I didn't start looking at this till this morning because I couldn't get on SharePoint, and I see you maybe even updated the one from what our engineer had given me. But with respect to the projects that are listed for Lake Elmo, it's disappointing to still see some of the comments that we submit about why things aren't feasible not being incorporated as these things continue to move forward. In a quick review of some of the other communities, it's concerning that Wood is putting forth things that don't seem to fit with the criteria. What I've noticed is in some communities, there's areas of neighborhoods that do not have PFAS contamination, yet there's neighborhood projects proposed for them. There's a community that is not developed, and yet there's comments about bringing services to them as they develop. Well, the rest of us have all said we've got to, development will pay for that. We're not going to be supplementing that in the future. So I see some inconsistencies as far as how we're applying some of these things, but hopefully there'll be some time to go through this in more detail, and we can get comments back to you at a later date as well. But that's just kind of the really quick cursory glance of things that I noticed.
Well, with Oakdale, we are unique, as has been pointed out, in the fact that we already have a treatment system, but that treatment system only does treat 2 of our wells. And but that kind of goes to what Ryan was saying. Our system to this point is a groundwater system that has a treatment option, and so we'd obviously be looking at something more that would just enhance that treatment option of groundwater, because that's how our system is set up, and we'd like to actually be able to fully utilize our system as well with all the wells that we have, and which we're not able to at this point. So I guess we are that unique community in the sense that we have already gone through this just a little bit, but I guess continuing to look at those options and starting to drill down on some of those scenarios is what we'd be interested in. Like, how does this scenario affect us, or affect the different communities, and how we can react to those different scenarios, and running those models is correct me if I'm wrong, Monica, but we're kind of getting to that point where we just kind of want to see how some of these options would affect us.
It's really great. It's really great to hear from each and every one of you. We're going to try to create more opportunities like this. Anything that the co-trustees want to see in response before we turn to the public?
I think I'd like to hear more on the development piece, because I think that's that's a theme we've had in past meetings, cost shares and that, and what it exactly is meant there. In more detail in writing later, but I think it's a good conversation for all the folks to be a part of.
So now we're
You
later.
want me to call out the community?
No, just an example.
I was trying to be nice.
You're nicer more than once. We've had many conversations, I think, good conversations. No, I just think, in which ways, you don't have to use names and that, because we do have different communities in different parts, and I'll put one out. West Lakeland is an example where we have 600 plus private home wells, don't have a municipal system, but the one option is a more centralized system that could treat that, and how does that view in versus, we're also looking at some communities, if you look at it, you can see on the memos, this is what the population is today, this is what the population is, in 2040, and what's there. So I don't know if that's all that or parts of that, and you don't have to use names if you don't want.
Yeah. So I totally get the thing like West Lakeland and some of our other communities where you have existing homes and you need to get service to them. And again, I'll look at it closer, but it appeared to me and to our engineer when he read it that in one of the communities you're talking about building out for future residents, new residents coming in. And again, I just thought that was kind of off the table in our communities where development is coming. The expectation is that development pays for addressing that, building out that system in that area. For example, you're not going to subsidize bringing water main in there to help a development get off. We're going to go in where there's existing homes. That part makes sense to me, but not the going in where there aren't homes today.
Okay, that's very helpful. I wasn't sure if it was wells that if someone drops a well, if they need treatment, a well that someone may need treatment for. Many of these communities still need more wells. And if they're in places where treatment is needed because there isn't others, if that was it, or distribution system. So this was very helpful.
Thanks. So we'll get to a break here in just a moment, but I don't know if there's any questions or comments from members of the public.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting to listen to all of you. This is Gail Pearson. I had a question, and I was in DC on Tuesday for the Senate Oversight Committee. I'm involved on a national level with the AFFF litigation, and there were questions about what this group is doing and the work in Minnesota with regard to how they're going to use the settlement money to address the water contamination issues. So one of my questions is some or all of the information about the work being done here and the types of things that are options available to the public? I know it's available to this group, but I do know there was questions both by our court and then actually one of the legislatures asked, why haven't you spent the money when the settlement was in 2010? Obviously they had to be more informed, but there was a great deal of interest. So that's question one. The second question, because we also want to know what's going on across the country, and on August 23rd, the California Pollution Agency Offices of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment reduced their health-based values for PFOA to 5.1 parts per trillion, and for PFOS to 6.5 parts per trillion. So like New York, California values are now lower than Minnesota. So both folks are looking at us, and we should be looking at others. So thank you so much.
A couple of quick answers. In terms of the projects, we're trying to polish these up a little bit at the end of October, where we want to have a public meeting that includes folks being able to see the conceptual projects. I think part of the feedback today is very helpful, especially on the questions about how we present the information to folks, especially those that don't have as much technical detail. I think we were thinking that the spreadsheet would be easier than going through all the memos. I think we erred on that calculation, so that was very helpful. But I think hearing how to present this to that wider audience is part of it. So yes, it will be eventually moved out to a more public realm, although these presentations and everything are on the website, so that will be shared in that terms. We have had folks, other states, Michigan, Wisconsin, ask us what we're doing. We're able to share that, but we haven't been necessarily outreaching to the federal level and talking and explaining what we're doing, but we're more than open to those conversations. So I think that was question one. Question two on the standards, I'm gonna have to punt a little to the Department of Health.
It was just a comment, not
Okay.
a question. Thank you.
Yeah, and just one clarification, the California number is a notification number and not an action level.
Correct.
And that's a big difference. They're still looking at their action level. And the reason I know is I was through the IRTC's numbers, looking at those just a couple days ago when we had a national conference call on what other states were doing. And as we are keeping very close eyes on that. And I think in the citizen business group conversation, both Kevin and Monica mentioned it, a very strong conversation about when we treat, it should be treat to not detect for some of those reasons of knowing what PFAS may be a concern in the future and what those levels may be in the future.
Okay, you've earned yourself a break. Thank you so much.
Do we want to finish this
I'm sorry.
presentation up?
I can wrap it. So I think this has been really great. The comments that you guys have and everything that you've shared is exactly what we are looking for, especially if it pertains specifically to issues that you see in the projects, even if it's wording, any comments that you have, we want to encourage that because this is it. This is the final list that we're trying to put together. So we've extended the deadline a little bit for you to submit any new projects if you think there's something missing, or if you just have general comments. Please get us those by next Wednesday, the 25th. You can email them to the email I'm just showing, and we'll leave that up for a little bit. Plus, these slides will be posted as well. So that we can kind of finalize this comprehensive list and move forward with our evaluations. Anything that falls under the priority 1 will be incorporated, and like I said, those few that maybe fall under priority 2 will be dealt with and discussed moving forward as we do that. So, and that's it. We can take a break.
Back at 10:38, please. Understanding is that Brian is up next from Wood. And he's going to talk about the process coming up.
Next steps. Thank you, Mill. Once again, I'm Brian Hamrick with Wood. We're going over the process flow map and where we go from here. So part of the last few months, we've been focusing on getting this concept project list together, which is really looking at all the potential options that are out there. Going forward, once this list is finalized, which at the end of the month is kind of the deadline for that, we're going to start breaking them down into different scenarios. And this is where we're taking the 140-some projects, and we're going to take 40 of those, put those into scenario 1, 60 of them, put those in scenario 2, scenario 3, scenario 4, and whatnot. So we're looking at 4 kind of distinct groups. Scenario 1 is kind of the community specific, where it's really looking at just options for Woodbury and their citizens. We're not looking at interconnects with other cities. Scenario group 2 is the regional water supply. That could either be surface water, it could also be groundwater. And then 3 is more of a treatment, treating the existing wells that are in place. And 4 is more of an integrated approach that could be a combination of all 3. Getting into a little bit more details on those, as I mentioned, the community specific is really just looking at the existing, water systems and doing projects that just meet the needs for those people. That doesn't include interconnects, sending water to a neighboring, system. It's only looking at those for that community. In scenario 2, this is kind of an example of maybe the iterative process we might go through. We're planning to do about 10 iterations for each of these scenarios. So the first one might be, big surface water plant on the Mississippi River. What does it take to get that out to everybody? What does that cost? And then the next one might be doing like a smaller grouping. Look at the big plant on the Mississippi, maybe something small in St. Croix. What are the lines that are needed? What does that cost? And then we'll break it down even further to, well, that doesn't look feasible, so then we're gonna do like maybe a groundwater like well field. We'll put 4 or 5 wells, we'll put them in Afton, put them someplace where the water quality is decent, and then send that out to neighboring communities. Another iteration might be, we do all those, but then we recognize that we can't get water mains out to this neighborhood because it's too expensive. So then they're just gonna keep, maybe do like a Poland system where they just treat their own individual private wells. So this is where we really look into a lot of the different options, and we start really screening it and filtering it down to get to a solution. For the treatment scenario, this is where we're just looking at, everybody has their existing private wells, we have existing municipal wells. What's the cost to just treat those? And that'd be some of the different iterations there. Might be treating to just what the the minimum drinking water standard is now. What's that cost? What's the cost for treating down to like non-detect? So we can get a range, so we can make some decisions like that. Then the last one is really the integrated scenario grouping, where we're going to take ideas from the other 3. This is what we'll do last, because some stuff's going to drop out and be obvious that this is the way to go. And we're going to put all those together, and this will be kind of what Wood thinks might be the best scenario. And then in each one of these scenarios, as we go through these iterations, we'll be comparing them against both the drinking water model, which is the hydraulic model of everyone's public water system, and also the groundwater model, to see, help us figure out what the costs are. Is infrastructure in place to move water across the city? If we want to add a well here, do we need to upgrade the mains? And those will give us an idea what the infrastructure costs are. And then with the groundwater model is, if we want to do 3 or 4 wells over here and move that water over there, do we have the availability of water in the ground that's sustainable? And also, what's the impact on the plume? Is that going to cause migration? Should we maybe locate those wells someplace else? So as we put those, into the models, get those inputs, see what comes out of it, and then we'll use those to help refine our list and help filter it down to a better solution. Let's see. And this process should be happening over the next 2 months, October, November. And we are planning to meet with the individual LGUs either next month or the month after. They go through these scenarios and what we come up with and get some feedback on those. And as I mentioned before, we are going to use the modeling results to help develop costs for all these different scenarios. And then we'll kind of end up with some recommendations for each grouping, and then we'll just summarize those and then a result summary at the end. So in December, we're planning to release the preliminary results, and then in January, you'll have opportunity for people to review those and submit those comments back to us. And then after that, we'll start working on the draft conceptual drinking water supply plan. That should be compiled in January with a review in February, and the final version should be done in March. All right, any questions or comments? So hopefully Clint kind of addressed maybe some part of the filtering process and kind of the timeline as well. All right, thank you very much.
Terrell is up next. A lot of your questions earlier about the criteria, that's what she's going to get into now.
Okay, great, thank you. So I am going to be talking about this document that we distributed last week. So this is our proposed framework for applying the priority 1 criteria to the scenarios. And as we noted in this document and on this, this slide, that this is very much a draft framework. This is kind of our initial take at it, but we wanted to share it with you at this point to get your thoughts on it. And then we will continue to refine it over the next month or so. So we kind of teed up the conversation last month. We wanted to present our thoughts this month, and then we'll be more discussing your feedback and thoughts next month. And we'll be having a survey that we send out after this meeting to get your feedback that way as well. So we're happy to answer any questions today and talk through stuff, but we'll also have a chance to talk through your feedback and input at next month's meeting as well. All right, and as Brian just walked through, so we will be applying the priority 1 criteria. So these are the sets of criteria that we developed a while back. So we will be applying them around this final step within the process. So we're thinking that, you know, we'll have a draft conceptual drinking water supply plan that presents the preliminary results summary, and then between the draft and final, the trustees will apply the priority 1 criteria to come up with a recommendation that will then be part of that final conceptual drinking water supply plan. So a recommendation, so it's just really the scenarios will be presented in the draft, and then the actual recommendation will be presented in the final. And then the priority 1 criteria will be applied at the scenario level of the scenarios, or kind of the repackaged scenarios that Wood will be coming up with. This will be done by the co-trustees.
Carol, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So as I see this project kind of moving toward the conceptual drinking water supply plan, this criteria document is really critical. This is the filter, as I understand it, that projects will be poured through and sifted into funded and non-funded projects. So it's sometimes hard, particularly at a big picture level, to understand how something like this works. So I was wondering if, to understand this better, if you could run at a future meeting some scenarios through it so we understand how this would work. So take some fictional project, okay, run it through the criteria and show us how you would score it so we can see how this thing really works. Because it's one thing to have this in concept, then you, the state agencies, will take this and decide funded from non-funded projects. So I feel like this needs to be test driven. And so I'm just suggesting, can we do a couple, 2, 3 test drives of this at a future meeting so we make sure as we agree to this, this is how it works, this is how it's going to apply, this is how it's going to screen things out, and what's in and what's out, all right? Because, again, it's hard to sort of look at these words and see how it really deals with an application and how it might work.
Yep, so that's a good suggestion. And as a note that I think the way we're thinking of it, that we'll be using these criteria at the scenario level, which will include sets of projects. So it's really kind of taking looking at that lens of a scenario. So that will include many projects that address drinking water for all of the communities in the area. And that's one thing that I'll talk about, that when we start to look through these criteria, that I think we developed them thinking of evaluating them at a project level, but for this we were really thinking at the higher scenario level. So then more of like a holistic view, for that scenario.
So this is not project level, right?
No, this what we circulated is at the scenario level.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, just for scenarios, right there. Okay.
And I think that's where we also want your thoughts, on, do these criteria make sense at a scenario level, and then how do we apply those when we're thinking of it at that holistic scenario level.
Good.
Okay. And I think I basically said a lot of this, but so, you know, we have said that we use these priority 1 criteria to help the recommendation of the scenarios. And so we've developed this draft framework to help try to kind of frame how we will do that. But this is really our kind of, you know, initial take at it. It's draft, and we're really, you know, wanting feedback from you all on how you think this would actually work, and if, you know, we have developed this in the right way. We also do have a note. So, you know, we want to obviously use these criteria to help the trustees make, you know, their decisions. But we also just wanted to note that that just to meet really, you know, the purpose of the settlement and the purpose of the conceptual drinking water supply plan, that there's a possibility that the co-trustees may consider other factors in making the final recommendation. This was something that was brought up at the last meeting to really, if, you know, there are additional factors that will be considered, to really iron those out kind of before that recommendation is made. So make that clear on if there are other factors, what those are. I don't know, Kirk, if you want to.
I just think we broke my own rule. As we go through here, if we find things after this is set, the goal is to have this set before the preliminary things, and we start seeing scenarios, and there starts to be questions, and we start getting feedback from the work group that now seeing the scenarios, this doesn't address this in a manner that needs to be addressed. You know, we can, with the recommendations and consulting with the work group, see if there are other things that need to be pulled in at a later time. Our goal is to have this all wrapped up, and I think I'm getting ahead of us, before we start seeing stuff coming back from Wood. But once we see that, we know that we may have to make a tweak as we look at this, and it's just making sure folks understand that.
And I think, Clint, also to your point that, you know, if we, you know, start to kind of test run this with a kind of example scenario, that maybe there's, you know, there's some things that just don't make sense, or maybe there's something else that does seem, you know, to be important that we should consider. But again, yeah, we do want to document that process, you know, before we get to that step, to make it so we're, you know, transparent on that decision making. But I think just as we're starting this, there may be other things that we'll want to think about. Okay, so as you can see from this document, so we have I think the 20 criteria that we developed a while back. This is the initial document that we developed. It was finalized in November 2018, but then we just updated the formatting in March. So we started from this document that we finalized that presents the 20 priority 1 criteria. So our plan is to use these priority 1 criteria to help evaluate the different scenarios, and going through each of those different sets of criteria related to focus, which is more of the PFAS exceedances, that implementation group of criteria, cost criteria, and what we call other criteria that's more related to acceptance. And again, as I mentioned, as we were starting to go through these criteria and looking at a scenario level, we found that some of the criteria did not necessarily seem applicable anymore. And that's one thing in this document, that we did start to gray out some of the criteria because we felt like they were not necessarily applicable at the scenario level, mainly because they may already be addressed, you know, so there wouldn't be that kind of risk, or that it just, when you're looking across many projects, it just didn't seem, it seemed a bit hard to actually come up with any ranking for that. So in this document, so we have the 20 criteria, and then we have a column for rank of the criteria. So our thought is that you know, for each scenario, we'll walk through each of these criteria and provide a rank to that criteria. So we have a little rubric, what we're calling a rubric here, where a criteria would get a plus, a O, or a minus, based on how well it does against that specific criteria. And again, there's some that we decided were not really applicable at a scenario level, so we grade them out. So we started to draft this rubric of the, you know, the plus, O minus, but want your thoughts on, does that make sense, or other things that we should consider, are there things that, you don't think make sense to include. So our thought is that we'll apply this rank to each of the criteria, and then we will basically compile and summarize the rankings per scenario, so then look across all of the scenarios together and see how they fall out against these criteria. We also acknowledge that when we did the survey a while back, that there were some criteria that seemed to have more importance than other criteria, so we also wanted to capture that as well. So in addition to this rank that you see in this table, we also have a column for priority. So this is where we just try to capture that there may be some criteria that are a little bit more important or have a higher priority than other criteria. So we have, and based on the survey results, it seemed like that the focus criteria that we had were coming out more as a more important to the work group. So we have that as a high priority. The implementation and cost criteria seem to kind of come out in the middle, so important, but a little bit lower than the focus criteria, so we set that as a medium priority. And then the other set of criteria related to acceptance, we gave a low priority based on that. That seemed to fall a little bit lower, and I can present those survey results again to go through that. But then our thought is then to, so during that step of evaluating these scenarios, so consider the ranking across all of the scenarios, and then also the priority of that criteria when the co-trustees are making that kind of final decision on what is that good, better, best scenario. I also noted this at the last meeting that we did initially have a little bit more of a quantitative framework for this, where we had numbers for the rankings and we had weights to the criteria. But I think we felt that that since there is some subjectivity into making these rankings, that it felt like it maybe may have give like a false sense of accuracy or precision. So we stepped it back a little bit to this more qualitative framework. And I'll also note that I've done this kind of evaluation on other programs. So for the Deepwater Horizon Restoration Program, that they use this kind of framework, the plus, zero, minus. They've kind of gotten away from more of the quantitative framework, and I think mainly for that reason. For other programs that I've helped with, sometimes they do more of the quantitative framework, but I think we just had a little bit more comfort in this kind of framework. Yes, please.
Oh, she's comfortable.
Sorry. So if this is the appropriate time where you're looking for feedback, I guess my feedback would be that, in my opinion, 19 and 20 should not be low priorities. I think you've got to have supported by the local government, and you've got to have it supported by the public. I said that early on. We don't want to be in the position of forcing things upon people. So I'm concerned that those are given low priorities.
Right. Yeah, and maybe actually I'll, so we will be sending out a survey to capture feedback. So one of our questions that we will be sending out in the survey is if you think the priority is appropriate, should have a higher priority, or should have a lower priority. So we'll be asking, hopefully everyone can fill out this survey, but yeah, getting your idea on if you think those weights are appropriate, kind of given where we are now, or not, how they should change. So I think we're obviously open to, get feedback now, but we'll be doing this survey, and we'll be discussing it at the next meeting as well.
I was just going to say that we're still glad to hear what you think now in the context of deliberation, but you'll also have a chance to weigh in later.
Yeah, and I think there's other things too, like Christina, you mentioned about the development piece and how that should be covered. I think there's another criteria, number 7, where we say addresses future needs and conditions, and one of our examples is population growth. So I don't know if that may get at the development piece, but how we want to think about that too. Do we want to, how much do we want to consider kind of population growth for a scenario? So I think there's just a lot of just kind of going through each of these criteria and helping us think about what we should be a higher priority or should have more importance.
Carol, would you mind, I know you skipped over
Yeah.
some slides, just to show how we did get the high,
Oh, yeah.
medium, low. They weren't something that the trustees or Wood or AFT put together, but this is, we used information we had gotten from everyone.
Yeah, so this is the survey that we sent out back in November 2018, I think, and we sent it to both of the work groups and asked you all to rank whether the criteria is most important, more important, or somewhat important. So we based those priorities off of this initial survey that we did. And I grayed out the ones that we listed as not applicable in this document. So here for the focus criteria, so we listed this as high priority because it seemed to be most important to folks. And then the next two sets of criteria, so the implementation criteria, this seemed to kind of, come out in the middle across a lot of these. Oh, and actually one thing that, I think I actually mentioned it, that there was one criteria that we added between when we did this survey and when we finalized it in November, so the month between October and November. So we didn't actually have a value or a survey for or results for this specific one. Yes, we listed both of these as medium priority. And then for the other acceptance criteria, this seemed to just come out more on the lower side, which is why we listed it as low. But again, I think, we're interested to, that was a while ago. So, if there's thoughts on changing that.
Yeah, I guess this has been a good process, and to Clint's point earlier, it helps when we run through these. I think when I filled out this survey a year ago, we all hate Met Council, so that gets a low priority, right? And we all thought, if we have ordinances or rules or something that would be in the way that we could change them. And so maybe I'm not thinking of those things in the way they are, but just given the conversations that we've had over the last year, I know that my rankings would change. So it's been helpful, I think, to go through some of these expedited projects and understand how these things can be applied.
Yeah, so then, so I think, for this survey, so one of the things I think, Clint, you asked last month to do some kind of survey to get our feedback for this, so that's what we tried to do. So we have a series of questions that will be within the survey. It'll be Survey Gizmo, and it should be pretty easy to use and fill out, hopefully. So we have one question. Do you have any additions, refinements to the list of priority 1 criteria? So regardless of how this is actually being used at the scenario level, are there any just kind of general changes you think should be made to that initial document? And that was something that was a request to at least just revisit that document at this point. So then, if you do think there are any changes, what are your additions or refinements? Number 2, for the applicable criteria at the scenario level, do you have any refinements to the +O- rubric? If yes, what are your suggestions? So that is that middle column, that rank column. So if you have any thoughts on, what should get, what constitutes a plus or a O or a minus. And then also I think for some of the examples that we provide with the criteria, how we're just kind of interpreting that criteria. And then specifically, as you'll notice, for the first criteria, the focus criteria that's related to, that says, where we say projects that directly address water supplies where health-based values, health risk limits, and/or health risk indices per PFAS are exceeded will be evaluated more favorably. So this was based off of some of the language that was in the settlement, which I think was why we set this criteria. For the rank, we have a note this is still under development pending feedback. We were, internally, we were not sure how to actually assign a rubric for this one. So we're just, in addition to just reviewing all of them, we would like your thoughts on what you think about this criteria and how we would apply this to a scenario level. So again, we're not applying it to specific projects, we're applying it across a set of projects, for all communities. So how we would think about that at that level.
I think I need Bill first.
Sorry.
again, the survey, I'm sure will pick this up, as I read it, there's one part that seems, this is very logical, very understandable. On the other side, though, as I was thinking more about it, if this became the high criteria, what is the potential that in applying this, we create systems that don't flow well together? So we'll have maybe an exceedance in one well, non-exceedances on another well, so we're treating for the one well but not the other well, but not considering where the future is, not providing the protection. So I worry if this is high, could we have systems that are disjointed, systems that don't work well together? And the question I have is, where does protection fall into it? So there's certain things where we know are above the health-based value today, but we don't know what's above the health-based value tomorrow. And so is there a place that the value of protection fits into here? Because I think what we want in the end is the work that we do is going to stand the test of time. And time is going to change. You know, California changed their standards, as you mentioned. I imagine Minnesota at some point will too. The flow will change, the characteristics of a well will change. So I just want to make sure that in doing number one, which seems logical, that we don't hurt the protection aspects, we create disjointed systems, and that we're not doing kind of a whack-a-mole approach based on where it's popping up all over. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, just to partially address it, the criteria number 7 talks about addresses future needs and conditions, and one of the examples we have is changing health-based values. So that, may be part of it, but I think there's also that broader, how, getting to non-detect for all households, which, has come up.
And I think this is one of the conversations we have with the citizen business group, or we refer to ourselves as lumpers or splitters. Some of us like to lump things together, some like to split off. And this number 7, maybe too much lumped together, and we need to pull out some of those specific things. To your point, Clint, and as Terrell mentioned, well, that's what we want to know. Are some of these too big, trying to capture too much, especially when you start putting in the rank? And I think that's where we've had some of the conversations where we're still uncertain. We didn't want to we wanted to get something out, have folks talk about it, and not necessarily have all the answers, because we don't know what they are. We want to hear what yours are before we are there too. And then that's a key one, please document and send in. And suggestions that there's a way to do that too, that you think within the framework will be helpful too.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so then we have, so a question related to, just that general refinements to the rubric, and also I think, part of that, if there's things that, should be split out, or things that, shouldn't be part of those examples. And then we have questions related to that priority of the criteria. And then if, for some of them, we listed as not applicable at the scenario level, so a question of if you think any should be applicable, and if so, which ones and why, and also providing some thoughts on, how you would actually rank it across the scenarios. And then any other comments, questions? So we'll be sending out this survey link in our follow-up email to the work groups, and we're just going to be sending it to the work groups. We're not planning to send it to the subgroup 1, so it'll just be the 2 work groups, and then I would very much like your feedback. Oh, sorry, there it is. So we're hoping to get feedback by the end of this month, so September 30th, and then we'd like to talk about it then at our October meeting. So going through what we heard, and then talking about any changes to make. And this may, be a little iterative over the next few months. We aren't actually going to be using this until early 2020, so we do have some time, to do kind of the pilot test run on it and see how it makes sense, and see if there's other things that we should add or things that we should remove. Any questions? All right, well, thank you for all the thoughtful input so far.
Okay. Carla's gonna talk to us about this document, that, the fact sheet that,
I've promised for so long. All right, so on the agenda, you'll see there's two items that I'm supposed to speak to. The first is the CDC health study, and it's been submitted, but we won't know if it will be funded for Minnesota until the end of this month. And so we can give a presentation next month or in November, whatever works best for you. But there is a fact sheet on our website, and now it's actually on the SharePoint website as well, or the settlement website. It's titled Health Implications of Exposure to PFAS Contaminated Drinking Water. It's a proposal for a multi-site study. So you can look at it yourself if you want more information. All right, so now, the fact sheet. So I've talked about this a couple times before, taking a look at both the benefits and costs of community public water systems versus private wells. And I really tried to provide an honest and thorough sort of assessment of, if I'm a private well owner, what should I expect if I'm hooking up to a community water system? So a little bit of background information. A community water system is a system that serves at least 15 homes or 25 year-round residents. Approximately 1,000 in Minnesota. The largest is Minneapolis, and the smallest are typically manufactured home parks, housing developments, and apartment buildings. And so I would not be surprised in Washington County if we'd see maybe some additional community water systems that are housing developments. There's a potential there. And there are both benefits and costs for homeowners to connect to a community water system. And so this is a draft fact sheet that was set out at the front table. I hope you all have a copy. But it's just sort of a starting point for discussion, and I'm looking for lots of input and edits, and I'll provide my email address and Michelle Mabry's shortly, so you can share those with those within the next week or so.
Anybody need a copy of that?
I do.
All right, grab it.
So I will say, so I'm the Community Public Water Supply Unit Supervisor, so I see a lot of benefits of being a community water system, but I really tried to be honest in what a private well owner should expect. So when you're a public water system, you have a source water protection plan, and there's action items that go with that to protect your wellhead. There's regular inspections and site visits by MDH engineers. So on average, there's an engineer on site every 6 months or so, between 18-month sanitary surveys and regular monitoring that's required under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Every community system has to have a certified water operator. They have to have regular continuing education credits to continue to be a certified operator. There's an annual water quality report for every community system. They're called the Consumer Confidence Reports. And basically it provides all the data on reported defects within the past 5 years. So they're fairly thorough. There's an opportunity for them to be better, and so actually EPA is looking at making improvements when it comes to those reports. There's regular monitoring for 100+ contaminants, and that includes both the regular monitoring under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and then occasionally there'll be unregulated contaminant monitoring as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act as well. The water quality has to meet the Safe Drinking Water Act, so for those 100+ contaminants, it must meet those. There's a requirement for consistent pressure and volume, so if there's a power outage, we require that that system continue to provide pressure and volume. So typically we require 1-day storage, adequate well volumes to maintain that, emergency generators, things like that. And if a system can't do that, we require that they issue a boil water advisory or do not drink advisory. So there's a protection there. And I will say, as a consumer of a public water supply, there's a lot of convenience in having someone else manage your water supply. But there are costs. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, you may have to have treatment, and oftentimes that would require disinfection. And you've seen that with whether it's GAC or ion exchange, they would also likely require disinfection, which then introduces disinfection byproducts, which are carcinogens. And so we just want to be very upfront with people that this is what you should expect.
And yesterday it was brought up, we also required fluoridation. And when it comes to disinfection, people have different sensitivities. You can't be allergic to chlorine. If anyone says that, we double check with our toxicologists, and that's not a thing, but you can be sensitive to it. And so some people are more sensitive than others. There's taste, odor issues, and sometimes it's just being acclimated to it. Over time, you just get used to it, and you don't notice it as much. But full disclosure to anyone that's on a private well. Also, there's requirements associated with meeting the Safe Drinking Water Act. As I mentioned before, there's the monitoring requirements, the water quality standards, but it's protection. You're protected from 100+ contaminants. And some homeowners prefer the option of managing their own water system. So some homeowners like that autonomy. I will say though, a lot of them, if there is a power outage, they often don't have emergency generators, and so they may be out of water and power.
Carla, is there any change in philosophy about fluoridation? Is that still, because I know in Europe, many countries don't have fluoridation. They view it as a chemical that has some downsides and has some hazards to it.
Sure, so actually CDC, about 3 years ago, they dropped the recommended concentration. So it used to be in Minnesota, the recommended concentration was 0.9 to 1.5 parts per million, and now it's dropped to, it'll be 0.6 to 0.9, I believe. 0.5 to 0.9 parts per million. And so municipalities throughout Minnesota are required to fluoridate, but the numbers have dropped. And you're right though, there's some people though that feel that there should be no fluoride added, but CDC does provide that recommendation. So that's something that I can add to that fact sheet that talks to that. All right, so you can see on the fact sheet, we actually put together some numbers, and I'll say it was really helpful to have a fact sheet that the state of Alaska had put together that speaks to private well owners as well, but theirs was about 5 pages long. And so some of the comments I'm going to look to get back from you is, first of all, the audience. Who do you want this fact sheet to serve? Is it private well owners? Is it local government units? Because they're two very different audiences, and we could create 2 fact sheets. One, a very simple one for private well owners, and one that's much more in-depth or has more complexity for LGUs, because there's a lot of good information I didn't include here just because it got to be rather lengthy. So some of the costs to consider, using a community water system, there's the initial service connection, and that's the connection from the water main. Typically it's the homeowner that owns it either from the curb stop, it's basically the valve that turns off and on the water coming from the main, or the main itself. And service connection repair, so it doesn't happen very often, but once in a while there is a repair that would be needed. And system billing, and that includes the water quality testing. MDH collects a service connection fee from all municipalities to pay for that 100+ contaminant monitoring. But what was really interesting in looking at system billing, in Washington County you have a very wide range of water rates, and you all know that too. So what I tried to do is find a mean and put that in the fact sheet, and I also provided the ranges for the various communities. So cost to use a private well, there's the well repair and replacement. So there's the citations, don't go into a lot of detail, but there's some sort of regular schedules that typically happen. You also have to repair, replace pumps, pressure tanks. I was surprised though, energy use, that wells use roughly $20 per year worth of energy. That's for a 3-bedroom home with regular water use. And then water quality testing. So I had presented this earlier to another group, and some of those private well owners were surprised when they realized that they're supposed to be testing the wells themselves for 5 different contaminants. So ideally, there's annual monitoring for bacteriological and nitrate, and then regular testing for lead, manganese, and arsenic. And a lot of these people didn't take that into consideration, and you can see the costs that go with that in the chart. So you as a community water system, you know what's happening for 100 different contaminants. Private well owner knows maybe what's happening for 5 different contaminants. So this is information that's not on the fact sheet, but I thought was really useful, and we can incorporate it into the fact sheet, because these are the questions I get quite frequently. It's easy to read it from here. So first of all, when it comes to settlement funding specifically, when it comes to a private well, it will be required to be sealed unless the PCA finds the well to be useful for conversion to a monitoring well. So that's one layer. A second layer, the Minnesota Well Code also requires that a well not in use be sealed unless MDH determines a well maintenance permit may be allowed, and there's an annual fee that goes with that. And there's no guarantee that they'll allow a maintenance permit. They look at the different items like location, construction, potential safety, or health hazard. There's a third layer. So there's the Minnesota Plumbing Code, and basically it says if a public water supply is accessible, the water distribution shall be connected to it unless otherwise permitted by the authority having jurisdiction. That's the LGU, the municipality, township, or perhaps the county. And then the fourth layer, in addition, the plumbing code does not allow cross connections. So if a property owner kept their well, not only would they have to pay the fee if they were allowed to, but they'd also have to make sure that that private well had no opportunity to feed back into the municipal water system. And then lastly, local units of government may have additional requirements. And so I took a look at all your different ordinances, and there's sort of it's a mixed bag. Some ordinances, and this is true statewide when it comes to city ordinances, sometimes they'll cite specific elements of the Minnesota Plumbing Code or the Minnesota Well Code to really sort of reinforce that. And then otherwise they'll just be silent because it is a state requirement. So as a municipality, that's your choice in how you define that. And I will say, this last item with local units of government, it's a little controversial, but roughly 5 years ago, there was a legal interpretation of the Minnesota Well Code. And what it says is that, I'm actually gonna read it verbatim, that basically, the Minnesota Well Code does not prohibit city well bans. And what you can do is go to the League of Minnesota Cities website, or the Minnesota Rural Water Association website, and they have ordinance language that you can use if you want to insert that into your ordinances that specifically speaks to private wells. And most of the ordinances basically say you can't construct new wells within the municipal boundaries, and you're allowed to do that. It really doesn't speak to existing wells and what's allowed, but that doesn't mean we couldn't ask that question. And that's some of that information that might be useful as a secondary fact sheet for LGUs. So, now I'm thirsty. Any questions? I will say this, the whole topic of abandoned wells, sealed wells, hooking up to city water, the plumbing code, and cross connections is incredibly complex. And so, like I said, if we needed a fact sheet that specifically speaks to scenarios, we could do that as well, because it is complex, and so a scenario-based fact sheet could be useful, so.
Will this meet the needs? I know we've had conversations, some of the scenarios that we saw just a little bit ago, conceptual plans has specific issues of whether it's a rural water system versus a private well, or municipal versus private well. Is this going to be helpful? Are the right things covered as we continue to have those conversations, and people and the public can weigh in on the issue?
And I will say we can go into a lot more detail and specifics if that's helpful.
Carla, could you help me understand how you came up with the average billing rate?
Sure.
I mean, I've taken them for just our larger lots, and I know it's a lot more than the $310.
So I assumed a 3-bedroom home, which may or may not be conservative. Let's see. And I took 5 communities: Newport, Woodbury, St. Paul Park, Oakdale, Lake Elmo, and Cottage Grove. Actually, more than that. 1, 2, 3, 6. And, yeah. So basically, it was a 3-bedroom home, and I use that across the board, whether you're a private well or you're hooked up to city water.
So like how many thousands of gallons of water usage a year is
So
Did
in
that
Washington
translate?
County, the average,
Storm's estimate, 94 gallons a day.
Oh, did I miss that?
Yeah, it's in.
yeah, so the average household uses
Okay.
94 gallons per day per person, with 2.7 persons per household. And so that's where that's the number I used when I looked up all your water billing rates. And just for people's information, Met Council has a great website that you can look up rates, like 3 at a time, and compare them. It's not that Cottage Grove's water is any more expensive than Woodbury's, it's just that the financing structure is different. And so I try to make that clear to people too.
$200 cheaper than you, man.
Or maybe it is, I don't know.
It's great water.
That number was higher than I thought. Did you take into account if it's quarterly or monthly billing? Because we have tiers, and our highest tier is significantly higher, and we bill monthly. So residents don't actually kick into that high tier, but if you did it quarterly.
So this is an annual, and I need to make it clear that all these costs are annual costs.
Okay.
So, but it's good that I double check the numbers anyways.
Because our low tier is quite low, so I think our average, we typically see a lot less, because with monthly billing, people don't kick into those higher tiers as much, so just something to check.
And if you see errors here too, please let me know. So I want to make sure that this is as accurate as possible.
So I appreciate you doing all the work, Carla, but after seeing it, I'm not sure I want to share this with folks, because as I look at the math, it's more expensive to be on city water, even with your numbers, as opposed to what I've told them, than to keep their private well. And so, you know, it might be some of the other benefits and those type of things that we emphasize, and I'd love to hear more about any options for them to keep their wells open if they're not contaminated and things like that, but I'm surprised that it came out that way. I was really hoping it'd be the other way.
Yeah, so I mean, I was a little surprised too. I will say, if you look at the new service connection cost, it's paid, we try to highlight, it's paid by homeowner. So a lot of these homeowners aren't gonna pay for their service connections. And so we can make this very specific to Washington County and this situation, because that takes that $340 off the table.
Yeah, it's paid by the developer.
Yeah. Kirk was gonna say something.
It was just what Carla was saying, in this situation, for neighborhood hookups, the hookup, that first line is paid for by the settlement. Or if it's a new home, you know, if we're going in right now, there's a contaminant, even now, if we find one, and we've seen this in Lakeland, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, we find private well owners that have a main right in front of them, and we have them over the health indexed. If we hook them up to the main, that connection is paid for through the consent order or settlement, depending on the piece. So that, I think that just, it's a little different tweak. Carla's just trying to get everything out there, and maybe there's another column saying, in this situation, when the settlement's applying, these things don't apply to you, type thing.
Right.
Just real quick, I ran our number, and with that 8,000 gallons a month, and our base fee would be about $136 a year.
Okay,
So
so,
quarterly, billed monthly, so just, it makes our number look very high, so.
So there-
We can double check that.
yeah, so that's what, I'll write my
Double
email
check his
address.
It's quick math, but the number's surprising.
An interesting factoid you've got in here is less than 19% of private well owners actually get their stuff tested.
Yes.
To me, that is the huge deal. Is there a way, again, it's back to that conversation we've had multiple times over our worker life about, I mean, you list 5 things that have to be tested.
Or recommended to test.
Recommended test. The whole thing about PFAS testing, you know, because again, the emphasis here is in these communities, but you've already noted, hey, it shows up somewhere else in the state too. So, I mean, the title of this thing is Benefits of Cost of Community Public Water Systems in Minnesota. Do you want to add in the layer somewhere about the PFAS thing? And maybe just a note about, hey, if you suspect you've got this issue, here's the special thing you do to get it tested. That to me, again, pertinent to our discussions and these work groups, would really add value to this document.
Yeah, so I was a little selfish. I was interested in, I've always thought it would be helpful to have a statewide fact sheet that addresses these issues, but I like the idea of something that's very specific to Washington County and really hit on those points. So, yes.
Just want to add one thing, just as a private well owner myself, I was just reading this as though I'm the private well owner, and how do I think about these numbers? And I think it's challenging because if you annualize it and you show that, you know, the comparison between municipal service, it doesn't account for the fact that most people, including me, do not budget for the well failure. I mean, that is just something that happens to you. And when it happens to you, it might be $1,700 to replace a pump, or if it happens like it did on Christmas Eve for us, it's $3,000 to replace the pump. And so when that happens, it's an immediate, you know, economic impact on the family. And I think there's got to be a way to articulate that somehow in the fact sheet, that when you don't, unless you're the best financial, you know, household, which many of you maybe, you may budget $100 a month for your tank replacement in 20 years, but I didn't. And so I don't know, how we articulate that is something we have to think about, I think.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons we wanted this fact sheet, because people don't think about the cost if they only pay it every 10 or 40 years, but it's a cost.
Yeah, I thought that was the original impetus for this whole thing, was that for people who kind of just automatically say, I don't pay anything if I have a well, you're saying, well, there are costs.
So I will ask quickly, the LGUs, would it be helpful to have a longer fact sheet that speaks to what your authorities are as a municipality, like what options you have in dealing with sealing wells, new wells,
Yes.
and cross connections? Okay,
Can you hear their heads nodding?
yes, I see. I've dug deep enough that it's not gonna be that hard to do. So, I've done the research. All right, well, thank you, and I'll put my email address up here, so.
Thank you. Back to Terrell, right?
And we'll be sending out an email with all of this information as well. I know we're asking for a lot of different comments through different mechanisms, so we'll just make sure we capture that in a follow-up email to you all. All right. So we just wanted to briefly touch upon another document that we've developed based on some requests by the different work groups. So we sent out this document last week. So this is a compilation of examples of other water systems, both in Minnesota as well as nationally. And a lot of these examples have come up in past conversations over the last couple months. And we've also had some requests from work group members to have folks come in and provide presentation on some other examples. So we thought as a first step, it'd be helpful just to at least have a document that does try to capture the different examples that have come up. And then if there are any specific examples, you know, once you've kind of had a chance to look at this and dive in a little more that you'd like to hear about, we can try to get either, you know, folks from those groups to come here, or Carla knows a lot about the ones in Minnesota, so she could also provide a presentation on some of those as well. But just as a quick overview, so we did already have some of these folks come in. So we had St. Paul Regional Water Services give a presentation, I think in late 2018. We had Lincoln Pipestone Rural Water come in, I think at that same meeting, to give a presentation. And then at the end of the document, we also had Mark Laurie give a presentation on a few other waters examples. So he talked about the Willamette River Water Coalition, the Southern Water Supply Project 2 in Boulder, and the Potomac River Basin, I think we talked about today. So this list captures things we've already heard about, but also some additional ones that have come up. So I don't know if there's any, if you have kind of thoughts now, or if we can also just send out an email, and once you've had a chance to review it and digest it, if there are other examples that seem relevant that you'd like to hear about, we can try to have those at upcoming meetings. Any thoughts now? We'll also be putting this in the follow-up email too. Hopefully it was helpful. Okay, now just talking about next steps. So again, we've shown this figure before, so we're still working on expedited projects. So we have, I think some of the contracts have been finalized, but we're still waiting to finalize the rest of them. And I think once we finalize all of them, then we'll be able to share that list with the work groups. And then for the conceptual drinking water supply plan, we are close to finishing identifying the conceptual projects. Then we'll be moving to the scenarios like Brian talked about, and then developing the draft conceptual drinking water supply plan. And again, I'm not showing, I didn't have another slide, but we will have subgroup 2 and 3, so getting at the conservation projects under priority 1 and the natural resource projects under priority 2 starting in early 2020 as well. Okay, and this is one of the tables that I presented at the last meeting. So again, things that are on the horizon. So in September, so we're asking for feedback on the conceptual project list by 9/25, and we'll provide information on how to send in that information. It'll be providing comments at the PFC email address. And then also providing feedback on the priority 1 criteria using the survey, and again, we'll send that link in the email. And then we had, for public engagement in September, we had the project ideas via the online portal was closed early the month. So in October, we'll be planning to discuss feedback on the priority 1 criteria based on the survey results. And we'll also be providing an update on the conceptual drinking water supply plan, so where Wood is on the scenario development and modeling. And then also an update on project 1007. We also are planning to distribute chapters 4 through 6 of the conceptual drinking water supply plan probably around the end of October. So that will also be going out to you all if you have time to review that. And we also said we'd provide chapters 1 through 3 as a reference. And then also Wood will be meeting with the LGUs to discuss some of the infrastructure or how the infrastructure is captured in the scenario modeling. So it sounded like that'd be in October, maybe November. And then we also do have public meetings set in October where we'll be talking about providing an update on MDH as well as the conceptual drinking water supply plan and presenting the final project list. So we have one set on October 22nd at Oakland Middle School and one on October 24th at Woodbury High School.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What kind of outreach are you doing on those other meetings?
Is Jeannie?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, the question was what kind of outreach we're doing for those public meetings. Jeannie, can I turn that over to you?
Jeannie with the Pollution Control Agency. Yep, we're working on public outreach for that. So we'll send out emails to the work groups. We also have the Gov delivery list. And then we're also going to reach out to the local newspapers, the local weekly newspapers.
Do you have suggestions?
In Maplewood, we were putting together an article, I worked with Jeannie on that, and our communications team was asking what kind of outreach the MPCA is doing. So just wanted to let them know. So it sounds like it'll be in the local paper.
Yep, we'll send it to them.
Doesn't mean they put it in.
Carol, what's project 1007? Is that like a secret project? I don't know what this is.
1007, yeah.
It's like, can we talk about it here in the meeting?
Take the one out, it's 007.
So the first priority within the settlement talks about Project 1007. Project 1007 is a stormwater, surface water project in northern part of this area. Is it from Lake Elmo, Oakdale, Lake Elmo, and then east? And one of the things was to look at is how is this acting as a conveyance system? And so we just want to give you an update on that.
I like your answer better.
It's the secret project.
Makes it sound much more
It's a secret that now we're going to make PFAS just disappear like this.
It has 007.
Yeah, it does have double.
I think that's
The first 007.
Yeah.
In November, we have discussed feedback on chapters 4 through 6, and then also have an update on the modeling, on the scenario modeling and results for the conceptual drinking water supply plan. And then in December, January, this is where we'll start getting the outputs from the modeling, so the preliminary results summary, and that will be going to the work groups in subgroup 1 to review, and also be released to the public for public comment, and having a public meeting in January for that as well. And then February, March, to develop the draft conceptual drinking water supply plan, and then finalize it in March. And then also set up subgroup 2 and 3 as part of, to start focusing on other types of projects. So I think this is still just a little bit redundant, but just near term, so we would love your feedback, input on the conceptual project list. So if there's anything that you think is missing from that list, to let Wood know, and we'll be to provide your comments to the PFC email, which we'll send out to you. And we're hoping to have that input by 9/25. Also provide feedback on priority 1 criteria. So we'll be sending out a survey for that. Requesting input by 9:30. And then there'll also be those LGU meetings that we'll be having to discuss infrastructure. So if you do want to join those meetings, I would encourage you to reach out to your subgroup 1 member if you'd like to be part of them. And then we'll also be distributing chapters 4 through 6 at the end of October. So a lot of stuff coming up. Okay, so then we have meetings set for October, and our general kind of requests for future agenda topics. If you do want to hear about more any of the water supply examples, we can try to fit that in. Anything else that you think would be helpful?
Not at 3 hours and 45 minutes into the meeting. 2 hours.
All right.
So what questions, comments do we have from the public?
Since we have a little bit of time, I'm understand that you're going to accept feedback about the criteria, and I think I'll provide that. But I just wanted to point out one specifically, and the reason for pointing it out was also pointed out the fact that it was added later, and so when the survey was sent out about the criteria, there wasn't feedback about the priority of that criteria, but it's number 9, and it's about the unintended adverse health impacts of water. So I think, and the reason it was removed is it says not applicable to scenario level. I would actually argue that that's probably more applicable to scenario level than it is to project level. And I'll give you a specific example. If a scenario is going to involve switching to surface water for the region, there's significant water quality differences that have to be considered with that scenario. So there's also potential risks with doing that. So I think water quality needs to be somehow included even at the scenario level when you're talking about these scenarios. And if you remove this, there's nothing else here about actual water quality. So that would be my feedback about that. The specific example I used when I was talking about this before, and the reason it got added was in that using this example of switching to surface water, we have case examples in Minnesota where that has caused lead release or increased corrosiveness to plumbing in the water. So that's something that the communities need to consider. And if this is not on there at the scenario level, that's not being considered. So that would just be my feedback. And I wanted to bring it up because there wasn't that, that it wasn't included in the survey. So the work group members didn't have a chance to give feedback on whether that was a priority or not for them. I don't know how the work group members would feel about where that ranks on the priority, but I think water quality should be a pretty high priority on what you're looking at. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we said that it was not applicable, that we felt like even if there was some potential risk, that those would be considered in developing the option. So if, like, they do switch to surface water, that they would, you know, do those additional things to ensure that there's clean drinking water. But if, it sounds like you still feel like even if they do kind of all the appropriate things, that there still could be a risk that kind of is unforeseen and not addressed.
There needs, the specific case, which was in Brighton, that had lead exceedance, they did pre-planning before there was corrosion control introduced ahead of time. And even through all of that preliminary planning, which was considerable, they still had a lead exceedance. So, you know, I think it does still need to be considered. In addition to that, there's still going to be water quality differences depending on your source water. So when you're using groundwater, you're sort of naturally going to have less organics in the water, which means you're going to naturally have less disinfection byproducts. If you're using water from the Mississippi River, especially where it's being considered here downstream of the Minnesota River confluence, whether there's impacts from the metropolitan area, the source water could be substantially different from, say, what St. Paul's source water is, which is the chain of lakes, which doesn't have those impacts. So, you know, water quality, my point being is that water quality needs to be in the discussion when you're reviewing these scenarios.
Great, thank you.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for your conscientious engagement. See you next time.